happening, everybody, and welcome to episode 14 of DailyDevClub for Thursday the 30th of May. Today we're going to carry on with our Unity 2D top-down shooter project, Battle Shapes, and we're going to look at adding player damage. So making things a little bit more risky for the player, so that if they bump into or collide with the enemy characters, they'll take damage. And instead of showing that as another UI label, we'll sort of feed that back to the user as with a sort of visual indicator on the actual player character. So, without much further ado, let's get into the code. Okay, so before we get started on the player destruction and the player lives, one thing I did think about from yesterday's episode was now we have an enemy that we're sort of devolving the responsibility for the enemy hit over to our enemy script, so we can manage the lives and then destroy the game object. But now we have that enemy that's tougher to kill. It'd actually be quite good if the tougher they were to kill, the more points you got when you killed them in terms of the score. Because obviously at the minute you're getting, if we have a look in the projectile, we're sort of incrementing the score there by 10 points for every enemy you destroy, and actually you'll be incrementing the score for every hit, so you will get 30 points for the tougher enemy, which requires 3 hits, but maybe it'd be good to move that sort of logic over to the actual enemy so that each enemy can be configurable. So perhaps if we were to say you only got 5 points per hit, but then we'll return a value from here, which is if they're destroyed, they'll have an actual points value associated with the actual enemy. So every enemy you hit, you get 5 points, but then when you actually kill an enemy, you get however many points that particular enemy is defined. And obviously, the tougher the enemy, there can be a bigger amount of points. So to do that, on our enemy, what we'll do is we'll have another public variable as an int, and we'll call that score. And we'll default that to 10, and then what we'll do is we'll change this so this returns an int, and we will say if we've destroyed the game object, i.e. if the lives are left are less than 0, we will return our score, otherwise we'll just return 0. And in our projectile now, we can increment the score again based on that, on the return value from that. So actually we'll move that up to there, but we'll keep that up there. But yeah, so we are, when we have a collision now, we are getting the component for the enemy, we are calling hit on the enemy, that's calculating how many lives they have left, whether that destroys the object or not. If it does, we're returning this score that's assigned to the enemy, otherwise 0, and then we're destroying the projectile, and then for every hit we are adding 5 points anyway, and so we're creating a new enemy there, which is interesting as well. So that means that even if you hit an enemy that requires 3 hits, if you hit them once, we're creating a new enemy. So we actually only really want to do that if they are destroyed. So perhaps actually if we do this in here and we say if actually we'll say score equals that, and we'll say if score equals 0, which we know only happens when they're destroyed, and then increment the score by that, and we'll create a new enemy. Put the projectile destroying first, just to keep that nice and neat. Let's put that in there as well. Okay, so we tweak the flow of this a bit now, and so every time we hit an enemy, obviously the projectile gets destroyed and we're getting 5 points for hitting the enemy. Then we're retrieving the enemy component, we're letting the enemy calculate the hit, and if we're getting score for that enemy, then we're incrementing that score and creating a new one. And we know we only get a score back when the actual enemy is destroyed and they're out of lives. Cool, let's try that out then, see how that works. So they're destroying them one hit. We're getting 15 points. 5 for the hit and 10 for destroying them. Then we've got our new enemies and we're getting 5, 5, 5 and then the extra 10 when we kill them. So now it'd be quite good to actually change this enemy prefab. We go in here, we see score. What we'll do is we'll make that one 50. So if you kill that one, you get 50 points. So 5 points for a hit and 10 for a kill, so 15 for each one of these. And then as the new one comes in, let's try and isolate that a little bit if we can. So we're getting 1, 2, 3, and then 50 for the kill. So now we can see as we add different tougher enemies that require more hits, we can also make it more rewarding to take them on, and you get more points for them and your score increases. And again, we're just moving a little bit more of that logic then over to the enemy to handle, which makes sense. So, okay, so at the minute when we have our player character and they touch an enemy, nothing happens. Obviously indestructible, there's no way for them to die, it's just how much score you can get within the round timer. It'd be quite good if there's a bit more element of danger, so if we have a collision with our player and the enemy. So in the same way we have our enemies, we look at the prefabs, we have our rigid body and polygon collider, and then our projectiles has the polygon collider. And for our player, we can add this the same as the enemy, the rigid body and the polygon collider, and then detect those collisions. So let's add polygon collider and let's add rigid body 2D. And let's make the settings similar. Okay, so yeah, I think that's okay. So our player now has a collider. And let's just have a quick look at that. You can see it's just dropped all the way to the bottom of the screen. That's because it's still got gravity in effect. Where's that? Gravity scale needs to be 0, I think. Let's check the enemy, what I set it to. Yeah, 0. So obviously as we're doing a top-down 2D game, we don't need gravity taking effect because it doesn't really make any sense. There we go, let's fix that. So now we can see actually, look, when we bump into them, we've got physics in play already. We have to actually push past them now. We sort of push them aside and there's forces in play, obviously the force that we're applying as we push through them. So it looks a lot more sort of realistic and cool now anyway. But obviously what we really want is to take some kind of damage when we collide with them. So whereas the enemies at the minute we just got lives, obviously we don't necessarily want to have just 1 or 3 lives where the slightest touch we're going to destroy our player, but it would be good to have some kind of like damage that we take. So let us on the player object there, we will define what we want our health to be. We'll call it health, and we'll default that to 100. And again, we'll have a private health remaining. And on start, we'll always set that to the configured health. So then we want to define our collision. So in the same way as with the projectile, we obviously had our on collision enter 2D. On our player, we can do the same thing. Let's just log those out for the minute by logging out the name of the object that we're colliding with, just so we can see it, make sure it's what we're expecting. So let's fire that up, and we should see in the log when we bump into the enemies, we should see that being logged out. So we can see there. So bumping into them, we're having those collisions. So what would be quite good is if we took damage by doing that. Now we can effectively do that with our health remaining, and we can say every time we bump into an enemy we lose say that's 5 damage, 5 health points, sorry. We start with 100. So now if we do that and we log out our health, you can see that's all the way down to 0 now. So obviously when we get to 0, below 0, we're going to want less than equal to 0. We're going to want to destroy our player object. But the best thing to do, rather than just destroy that object, is obviously to stop the game like we have on the end of a round. So to do that, we're going to want to be able to reference the game manager from our player, and I think we did that in our projectile, so we did the same thing there. So what we can do is we set up a private variable to store that in, and the same as on our projectile, we find that with our tag on the start. That's one of the very first things we do, and then we have that reference to it for the lifetime of this player object. And then our game manager, our stop game at the minute, is a private method. We want to make that public so that we can call it from within here. So we'll call that, and we'll call stop game. So let's try that. So we see our health down here as we're getting hit, going, and when it goes below 0 or hits 0, even though our timer isn't up, we still have our game over state. And when we restart, now when we restart, it's coming straight back in. The reason for that, of course, is that our health hasn't been reset. So in our game manager, where we have this start and stop, where we're setting and resetting things, we are not actually destroying the player object, we're just resetting it. So that means that in here we need a way to effectively restart our health, reset it to the public variable up here. So let us, we have a reference to that in our game manager, but perhaps this is actually a good time to, in our stop game, it might make more sense to actually recreate our player and do it similar to how we have with enemies. So at the minute, obviously we have our player and it's up here, but if we were to turn it into a prefab, by doing what we did with the enemy, we have our player prefab, we can then delete it from here, and on our game object, our player, which is now missing, we will set to the prefab. Now if we run that, because it's a prefab, it doesn't exist yet, we haven't instantiated it, there is no player. So in our start game, we want to make sure that as well as creating the enemies, we also create our player. So we do that with an instantiate again, just like we did with the create enemy there. And we're going to do that with our player game object, which is the prefab now, not an actual active game object in the hierarchy. And we're going to put that in our a variable, so we have a reference to that. So we'll create a private variable for that, another game object, and we'll call that active player. So we'll pop that there. So that then instantiates that. And we're going to want to make sure that's nested as it was before beneath our play. So like we do for our create enemy. Here we set the transform, where are we? Down, there. We set the transform parent to the in-play transform. So we do exactly the same thing for our active player. So now if we go back to here, when we start the game, you should see that our player now gets instantiated and it's beneath the play. And let's simulate our health. Okay, so there we go, game over. When we restart, our start game kicks in, it pops it back in the right position, and we don't have the same problem with the health because now we have a new object, so we're reinstantiating that player each time. So instead of having to have a reference to the player and calling a method on it to say reset your health, all we're really doing is letting the player manage anything that it needs to manage, like health, in its initial start, which is sort of built in, as we know, to all the Unity objects, these mono behaviors, and then we're using the game manager to actually destroy and recreate that. It also means that if in the future we want to do some kind of say multiplayer, we have this player prefab that's now more reusable. So you could do sort of same screen co-op, or even network multiplayer, and you'd actually just have multiple player prefabs being instantiated. But that works quite nicely. Now, one thing I noticed with our colliders is that when we're shooting, we are getting an error and the projectile isn't going anywhere. Well, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And that's most likely because it's hitting the player bounding box and causing a collision. So we can double check that in our player. If we remove that, and we go back to logging out which collision it is, and we're going to see what it's colliding with, but it should be saying a player, I'm guessing. Oh, sorry, yeah, no, the code is on the player, isn't it? So it's the player that's kicking in with the projectile. So we want to make sure that if the projectile, so effectively we want to skip these for now. We'll come back to it because we're going to have enemy projectiles shortly. So we will want to handle those collisions, but for now we'll just say if the collision GameObject.name is with an enemy, then we'll do this. So in that way we're only handling collisions with an enemy, and we're skipping everything else. But now we have the opposite problem. So if we go to projectile, this one will be firing as well. So if we do debug log here, collision GameObject.name, this is where we'll then see that the projectile is triggering a collision as soon as it leaves the player with the player itself. You can set them there, and then that's causing an issue. So again, in here we want to make sure that if the game object is with the player, then we just return. We're not interested in carrying on with the rest of our logic if that's if our own projectile is hitting the player. Triggering, hang on a second. What was the name for that? Oh, it's because we've got player clone. Okay, so okay, so for now we'll pop that in there. We're going to revisit this in a minute anyway, because we are going to want projectiles to interact with the player. But for now we'll just do that so it skips it, and we'll tie that in a minute. So now we can see that's working nicely. So one odd thing is that all our enemies are just converging on the middle there. And the reason for that is I think they've lost their reference to where the player is. Or because the reference is a prefab, I guess it's always set to the middle. So when we create the enemy, and it has a reference to the player, we're going to want to make sure that's set not to the, we go to our create enemy, look, that's, because it's set to the prefab, that's always going to have the position in the middle and not the actual active player. So in here, when we do that, we're going to want to get component enemy, and we're going to want to make sure we set the player to be our active player. That way their reference is to the actual moving player and not the prefab. And then when they go to follow it with their sort of basic follow logic we have, then that's going to be based on where the player actually is and not the prefab. So that's still the prefab for some reason. We can see that, look, because it says player and not clone. So for example, if we were to overwrite that while it's running, you see that one particular enemy knows to chase now. Okay, so why is that not being set? Oh, it's because we were already setting it down here. My bad, okay, so I missed that. So we were already doing that, which makes sense, but like I say, that's setting it to the prefab, and we now have a different variable for our active player, which is instantiated from the prefab. Okay, so that was getting overwritten. Right, so now, well, let's have a look-see. There we go, and they're back to following around. Our projectiles are working nicely, everything's working as it was before, but we just have to worry about the player's health now. If they take too many hits, then they end up getting destroyed. Okay, let me just double check that's working still, because that took a lot of hits and just didn't trigger. Okay, so that'll be because that needs to be a clone as well. So like I said, we'll tidy that up in a minute so the references to the different collisions we actually want are a little bit neater. But for now that works. Yeah, we can see our health going down, and then we have our game over. So there's no way for the player to actually know what their health is at the minute. We could add another UI label, so we've got timer and score, we could add health. We might be in danger of cluttering the UI slightly there though. What we kind of cool is if we maybe just reduce the opacity on the player sprite, so it sort of fades out as he takes damage. That would at least be a quite visual way of doing it. So on our player we can see we have our sprite renderer there. So we're just going to want to, we could even, I wonder if we can change the colour so it actually goes, say, a darker shade of red or something like that. So in here we're going to want to get a reference to the sprite renderer, which is that there, and then we're going to want to set the colour. So that's where we can set the alpha. So let's just have a quick look at the docs as well for that. Yeah, so we can just set the colour. So if we wanted to do the alpha, we could do, so the colour is a new colour. So if we did, let's have a quick look at that. So that would be times the health remaining. Let's give that a whirl. So here we can just say we're setting the new colour, we're only changing the alpha, and we're doing that based on the health remaining, effectively as a percentage. Is that supposed to be a float, do we see, or an int? float. Let's see how that looks. Okay, so that didn't really work. Let's have another look. So look at our player clone. Okay, so if we take the existing colour, then that might be better, wouldn't it? So if we do that. And then we'll say sprite.color equals let's just log that out. Let's try that, just so we can see what that's doing. And so we're using the existing colour there. So the alpha is dropping. That didn't seem to be working, did it? Okay. Have a look, make sure our alpha is calculating properly. Of course, that needs to be between 0 and 1, doesn't it? So not 255, so that's, we need to scale that appropriately. So we can see that it's starting to fade out as it gets lower and lower health. But the other way we could do it is actually to make it redder and redder. So by reducing the G and the B components, the green and the blue. So we call that reduced colour instead. And we'll just reduce both those by the same amount, see what that looks like. We won't bother with the alpha. Let's see what that does for us. That might be more visually sort of impactful to actually just see the player character getting redder and redder to sort of signify danger. Let's have a look. Okay, so interestingly, it seems to affect the white part of the image, or the I guess it's not transparent, is it? It's only the white part. It doesn't affect the black part. So it still gives you an indicator, because you can see, I don't know why the alpha is starting so low. Let's have a quick look at that. Player. I think I left that value. Yep, there we go. But so interestingly, so we can see it here if we do it, it only seems to affect the actual pink bit, rather than the overall sprite. So perhaps if we do both, then we'll have an element of an element that sort of speaks to the danger of the reduced health with the red pointer, but then also reduce the opacity, so there's a sort of fade out there as well. Let's do that. So we use the reduced colour for the alpha as well, and let's see what that plays like. Oh, I left that. I keep leaving the colour not as it should be, right? Oh, that's right. Player, colour. Yeah. No, there we go. Okay, so it should be 255. Right, there we go. Bingo. Right, so that's set back to what it should be. So it should start right, and then as we take damage, we can just see that changes and we're fading out. Cool. Okay, so that's quite a nice visual way of seeing the health rather than having to have another UI label, and that seems to work nicely. Okay, so we've added player damage. When they run into the enemy characters, they take damage, and we sort of feed that back to the user with a visual indicator by changing the opacity and the colour on the player character. In tomorrow's episode, we'll add the ability for the enemies to actually shoot projectiles at the player. So another way for the player to take damage and sort of additional risk and danger, and upping the difficulty in the game, which will be interesting. So we'll cover that tomorrow. But I hope you liked today's episode. If you did, please give it a share, and of course don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to know when tomorrow's episode drops. Have a great day, and hope to see you back here tomorrow for the next episode of Daily Dev Club. Peace out. Hope you enjoyed that episode of Daily Dev Club. If you'd like to see another one, click this link right here. Suggestions and feedback are always welcome down below in the comments, please. And of course, if you want to know when the next episode drops, please smash that subscribe button.